think generally Singapore is a great place to live in. It's a land of opportunity, and as a city, it offers, it's a great cosmopolitan city. It's clean, it's green, relatively safe. From a career standpoint, we have lots of industries that are being based here, so there are lots of options that are available. And coupled with a very competitive pay framework, salary framework, I think that's quite attractive for people to relocate to Singapore. On the flip side, being a small city, property prices tend to be on a higher side because it's land scarce, and that could make housing prices a little bit on the pricier side. And again, because it's a small country, we import pretty much everything, and that drives the cost of living up. But all in all, I think it's a great city to live in.
The biggest challenges is people actually think that Singapore is a very easy landing ground. And I think they forget that as much as we're so cosmopolitan, we're so welcoming to foreigners, that there are still very local nuances that is understated. People don't really talk about it, but it boils down to cultural training, right? So while we seem so westernized, Singapore still holds tradition to heart. So if you walk around Singapore, you still see historical buildings being protected. Children in schools are learning about our history of Singapore, where we came from, why we value harmonious living. Between religions and races, we all think of ourselves as just one Singapore, not, oh, you are a Chinese or you're a Malay or an Indian. Everybody gets very protective when it comes to helping one another, and that might kind of be different from where the assignees are coming from. So it could be, there might be some xenophobic behavior or patterns that are in the communication, and that boils down to how the employer is then deciding, is this employee the right person to move? Is that employee ready for such a challenge? Are they adaptable? Do they have the broad mindset of accepting other people's culture and respecting it? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges I've had in terms of, just in a specific example, when you bring a Westerner to Asia and you're dealing with Singaporeans, you might find that the conversation is usually one way, and it's quite uncommon, I would say, to hear Singaporeans speak up and stand their ground. But then at the end of the day, the Westerner might find, the conversation went well, it's perfect, there was no objections, nothing. And then 3 days later, you hear, maybe an email saying, the person that you were speaking to, the Singaporean, is not happy, they had some concerns. So it's more of just educating and then assimilating to the culture of Singapore. I think that's fairly a big challenge for the people I've been moving in. It is a very soft landing ground compared to the other neighboring countries that we have. In terms of the infrastructure of accepting foreigners, the government has done a very good job. So some Singaporeans might still be, upset with the current government for whatever reason, but you can't deny that they were very forward-thinking. So when it comes to schooling, international schooling, we have a very good base of international schools here, catering to IB programs, GCSE programs, and then you have the expat community. So we have grocery stores, we have medical doctors that are just suited for foreigners. And they even one of the hospitals that I'm quite familiar with, they have a department just dealing with translation. And that means that when you call them up and you said, I'm coming, maybe I don't even speak English, I'm coming from Indonesia, I'm coming from Africa, and I need, kind of translation service throughout my entire medical treatment in the hospital, they will assign one translator to you the whole day and make sure that you understand fully what the diagnosis is. And I think that is very uncommon when we go to other countries, because if you go to Japan, the doctors only speak Japanese and sometimes English, but to have that feature of having translation services might be difficult, or it's not as common. And in Singapore, I think it's rewarding in that way, because then you're coming to a place where they are very welcoming, they're doing everything they can to make your life a lot easier. And yeah, people are very warm generally in Singapore, and they're very friendly and nice.
Yeah, I think by virtue of Singapore being safe and easy to assimilate into, where everybody speaks English, it's safe, there is little hesitation for families to move to Singapore for that reason. So in that sense, it makes it quite easy to move people here.
Global mobility programs, one of the biggest costs is actually tax. And I think the government has made it very, how would I call this? The government has made it very attractive in terms of tax. And if you compare to most countries, we have a lot of double tax agreements with quite a few people, with few countries. And then when assignees move, if they are taking care of taxes on their own, sometimes the tax cost is actually cheaper in Singapore than in their home location. If the company is taking care of the taxes, then it will be the company, saving some money. So when it comes to moving to Singapore, mobility programs are usually fairly cheaper, I think. Not in terms of housing, because housing in Singapore is still a landlord's market, but housing is definitely not as expensive as Hong Kong, and you don't have to do language training because our lingua franca is English, so everybody speaks English here. Most foreigners can actually send their children to public schools. You don't have to be in an international school, so it kind of works out both ways. Like, if there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of options moving to Singapore.
So for Singapore, I would say that it has a very strong infrastructure of transportation and housing. So whenever we need to relocate assignees or team members into the location, this does makes it easier because of the infrastructure that we actually have.
Yeah, I would say keep an open mind. It's an open culture. People are friendly, and I think it's really just to open yourself to the process.
I think the top tip number one is that when you're moving people into Singapore, don't assume that they're just gonna be okay and well adjusted. You do still need to put a lot of effort into giving them all the equipment and all the knowledge and all the tools that they can to kind of assimilate into the country quickly and then get started on what they're supposed to do. That's one. Number two, I think the top tip is, if you're moving families, you need to make sure that their children get into schools fairly quickly. So there are a lot of options for for international schools, but the top few international schools have a very, very long waiting list. So it could be like maybe a year or 2 years depending on which grade that they're going to. So always have that in mind when you're advising a family, because they might have to go into a holding school temporarily while their name is on the waiting list for the school that they want. So it's more of a transition for the children, and some families might not want that kind of breakage in education continuity, because then they have to be 6 months in a school and then they have to shift to another environment in a different school. So that's something to kind of let them know. The other thing is, in Singapore, you do have to pay the first month's rent and a security deposit when you secure housing. So for people that are paying, or for assignees that they have to take up their own personal lease, they have to pay for the rent themselves, just make sure that they have sufficient funds, or the company is providing some sort of support, because then they might be shocked when they come to Singapore and then they realize, oh, I have to take out so much money to secure a house, and then if the housing rent is below a certain amount, say maybe $4,000 a month, Singapore dollars, then they also have to pay the commission fees for the landlord's agent or their own agent. So these are all like hidden costs that they might not be aware. They might think, oh, it's easy, it's going to be cheap because you're just going to pay the rental. But there are a lot of hidden things in a tenancy agreement or in the school deposits and things like that you need to be aware, and then you need to advise them so that they can do financial planning.
So I would say that one top tip of relocating the assignees or team members to Singapore is really to understand what are their top concerns. So about 2 years back, I remember that we actually needed to move a group of Koreans over to Singapore. And back then, we actually realized that some of them have not been to Singapore before. So they have no idea what does it mean to them from a schooling standpoint or even from a housing standpoint. So what we did was to provide them with a orientation tour to help them have a better understanding of the location. So even with the pandemic, what we are doing differently is to utilize a virtual orientation tour so that they get a better understanding of the location before they move or before they move their family here.
Well, thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening in.